Scott Robertson at Wildlife Conservation Society. Probably this must have been about 7 months ago or so, and he had come across this idea that's really critical in criminology, and very, very well documented, that harsh sentences and punishments like prison are not effective in actually keeping people from reoffending or from deterring people from committing crime. And he's like, why is it that conservation organizations, animal rights organizations, the public are really still advocating, clamoring, calling for harsher sentences? And so the alternative to that, obviously, is more restorative justice approaches. And I had done a bit of work with the Scottish government about this. And so we decided to apply for some internal funding through my employer at Northumbria University to explore this in more depth. But we discovered, before we know about restorative justice approaches and who's doing it and who's not doing it, we actually need to know what is the global view of sentencing legislation and penalties around crime, and then where are their data and where are their not data. So Alison Hutchinson just finished her PhD in criminology, and she's going to share the part that she did about doing that really big view and all of the wildlife, forestry, and fisheries legislation she could find. After her, we're going to hear from Willis, and he did the rapid assessment of where can we find data about these offenses in the African and Asian countries. And then we'll hear from Maria, who did the rest of the world. So Europe, Oceania, North America, Latin America, and all of that. So they're each going to talk for 10 or so minutes, pretty informal since we don't have a huge audience, obviously. So yeah, I will turn it over to you, Ali, to start us off.
Okay, thank you. Just get my. Can you all see my screen okay? Can you see my screen?
Yep, that's good. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Thanks. Yeah, so as Tanya introduced, I was involved in the first part of this assessment, which focused on getting a better picture of wildlife-related offences and their corresponding penalties, so that we can really begin to understand how wildlife crimes are treated in legislation and how that might vary globally, and then to look at where are there opportunities for a restorative justice approach and where are there just gaps in knowledge on those legislations. So this dashboard and mapping tool draws from the legislation dataset that I've carried out to show the presence and treatment of wildlife-related offences on a country-by-country basis. So I'm just going to talk through ways in which you can interact with this and access the data. The search was carried out focusing on 3 groups of legislation, so wild species and ecosystems, fisheries and aquaculture, and forestry and plants. And these are all groups that you see within the FAO-LEX and the ECOLEX databases. Where information was lacking for some countries, it was also supplemented by environmental legislation and also by penal and criminal codes. But because we're focusing or trying to amplify this restorative justice approach, I've renamed these categories as wild animals with a marine focus, and wild plants. In all, just over 12,000 pieces of legislation were assessed, and that covers 185 countries. And that gives us a database with just over 3,000 individual wildlife offences and their corresponding penalties. To make comparisons between the offences on a global scale, the offences have been consolidated into common offence groups, which you can see in the second part of this filter. So for wild animals, a lot of the offences here would include cruelty and welfare violations, but we've also got hunting violations and also international trade, CITES regulations appears here as well. For the wild animals marine segment, a lot of this came from fisheries legislation. So it involves things like fishing beyond quota, fishing in protected areas and prohibited seasons. We also see non-compliance with CITES and trade violations as well. For wild plants, a lot of this comes from forestry regulations. So a lot of the offences here are around logging violations, so logging beyond the permitted amount or permitted limits. But we've also got offences around damage to habitat and environment, starting forest fires, and also damage to other wild species. So if we look at wild animals as an example, I'll show you how the dashboard can function. So if we look specifically at capturing, killing, injuring a protected species without authorization or in violation of a license, the results are displayed within the map here and are ranked by the severity of the penalties. So you can see that Canada is ranked fairly highly with a maximum fine of just under $800,000 and a maximum sentence of 60 months. And there are no minimum sentences mentioned here. But the legislation itself also includes a note that restoration or remediation is important to remediate those harms towards wildlife. Another example I wanted to show you from this is for the Philippines. Is it going to highlight? Oh, small country doesn't want to highlight. For the Philippines, so this is also ranked fairly highly with a maximum sentence of 144 months and a maximum fine of just under $19,000. We also have minimum sentences listed here, as well as restoration stipulated. The interesting thing about the Philippines was it also was one of very few countries that specified that the fines should increase year on year with inflation, and very few countries had notes or details of this, how fines would change over time. And a lot of the fines in these cases were very outdated, or in some cases even in currency that's no longer in use. So the fact that the Philippines had this was quite unique amongst some of the other countries. The graph to the right shows, keeps tab of the top 5 ranked countries for the offence that you're searching. So the fines are obviously larger than the sentences, but the sentences are on the right-hand side here. So you can see that for this particular offence, Romania, which is just here, has the highest maximum fine of just over $5 million. And if we look at the sentences, South Africa has the highest potential sentence of 120 months. I now just want to show you the drill down into the country by country focus. So here you can search by country and see the offences as they appear in legislation. So not the consolidated offence of the global map, but how it is actually described in the legislation. So, for example, if we select Afghanistan, we can see that the database has examples of 5 unique offences, 3 of which are wildlife related and 1 each for plants and marine species. And then if we drill down, you can see, for example, there's a regulation that prohibits damage to the colonies of bees or silkworms, and there's no information on additional penalties or fines here. There is a note that restoration is stipulated, but no further details. If you drill down into the map itself, you can see that the maximum fine is $56 US, and the sources of legislation are given here. I just want to show you another example. If I get the search to clear. Okay. Is that of Vietnam? So Vietnam was one of the few countries that actually specified non-custodial reforms in their sentences. And also one of the highest number of unique offences in their legislation. So if we just drill down, have a look at marine species, you can see there's lots of individual offences listed for fishing different amounts of prohibited or protected species, fishing different quantities of fish below size requirements. The element I wanted to show you was this one, exploiting aquatic products and precious or rare species. So this offence actually comes with a maximum fine of just over $4,000 and a minimum and maximum sentences for both varieties, but it was one of the few countries that actually have non-custodial reform. So as an option here, in lieu of those penalties, to have up to 3 years of non-custodial action. And finally, I just want to touch on the data availability. So this spread of the dashboard shows the countries that had the most individual offences and the countries with the least. A note here is we're hoping that this will be a living document that can be updated. So a lot of the countries that have fewer offences and penalties are probably just because it was impossible to find that legislation or translate that legislation. So at the bottom here, you can drill down and see the legislation itself that that information comes from, but we're hoping that it can be updated, and if there are elements that are obviously not the most up-to-date, then it should be, we can just keep on rolling and updating the dashboard, so to improve accuracy. That was just a whirlwind introduction to the dashboard, but please do let me know if you have any questions or want to see anything else in more detail.
Yeah, that's great, Ali. Do we want to move right on to Willis, if you're ready?
Okay, so let me just load it in a minute. It's coming, just a few seconds. Yeah, so can you see the screen? Yeah, so yeah, basically I'm going to go over the what we found in parts of Asia and Africa in regards to wildlife crime data, looking at the laws that are there in place, and some other areas where there are different legal frameworks. To start us off, we borrow the definition of wildlife crimes from the International Consortium on Combating Wildlife Crime, ICCWC, that talks about the taking, trading, importing, exporting, processing, and possessing, obtaining, and consumption of wild flora and fauna, including timber and other forest products, in contravention of national or international law. And of course, this is supported by the global legal frameworks, starting from the CITES in 1975 to the Bonn Convention, to the several UN resolutions that have been there in place. And of course, lastly, to target 15.7 of the SDGs. So looking at the laws, I could categorize them into several categories. One, we have laws that are CITES inspired, and they're basically try to categorize the flora and fauna into the appendices as prescribed in the CITES, and that comes from Malaysia, for example. And then we have laws that try to address wildlife crimes, and most of them, from the royal decrees. For example, the one that comes from Kuwait. As you can see, I think even Alison alluded to, some of them are quite lenient, if you want to put it that way. You can see this one talking about imprisonment of less than 6 months and not exceeding 5 years, and some money to be paid. And this I found to be common in most of the royal kingdoms across some parts of Asia. And if you look at the case of Botswana, and Botswana is interesting because similar to Tanzania, Botswana, the way they address issues of wildlife, especially the elephant and ivory trade, they're more liberal, not so stringent. Let's say compared to Kenya, where the penalties are very high and people go to prison for many years. The Botswana Wildlife Conservation and National Parks Act of 1992 talks about 7 years imprisonment and about $950 for hunting or capture of protected species, and this is more so on elephants and rhino. But of course, in most of the Arab world, there are hunting laws, and hunting laws were originally basically meant to control seasonal hunting, and most of them are quite old. I talk about the one in Egypt, which I think is from 1982. So the question then is, are they effective in addressing issues of wildlife crime, 30 years later? And sources of data, we got data from we got data from two main sources. A lot of it from the international NGOs, and in many of these areas that we got wildlife crime data, we found that these states had weak legal and institutional frameworks to address wildlife crime. And I could go across from Afghanistan all the way to Yemen. And most of this data came from NGOs such as Wildlife Conservation Society, the WWF, and Traffic. But in other cases, we also got them from national agencies. And in some cases, this also reflected a more robust institutional frameworks that are there to protect wild flora and fauna. For example, in the case of Cambodia, Cambodia is cited here because of the fact that it's a huge transit point, and the last report that talked about Cambodia, mentioned 3.2 tons of ivory having come from Mozambique. But they have institutions such as the Cambodia Wildlife Police. In India, they talked about Wildlife Crime Control Bureau. And Myanmar, they talked about National Wildlife Conservation Task Force. So a presence of institutions, whether effective or not, is another question altogether. And there was a lot of linkage between wildlife crime and war in places where there were conflicts, like in Yemen and in Syria. We found that there are, these countries acted as sources or transit routes for wildlife crime, illegal wildlife trade into other countries. And lastly, what areas could we focus on for further research? Cambodia still remains very, very interesting because there are a lot of wildlife illegal wildlife trade is going on there, and I mentioned the case of Mozambique, but also in East Africa, talking about countries like Somalia, Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Eritrea, and how their animals are being, are going all the way to Yemen into a conflict zone and onwards to the Arabian Gulf. That would be very, very interesting to look at. But again, in Asia, the good sources of data we found from atlas.com, Legal Atlas, which has published a lot on that in recent times, and of course from traffic. And in Africa, we could talk about the Eagle Enforcement Network, which is a network of civil societies in West Africa. We could also talk about the TWICS, which is a network of group of nations in Eastern Africa that are addressing this. But also we can talk about the Organized Crime Index that is always published by the GI and ENACT. Thank you.
Wonderful, Willis. Thank you. We'll turn it over to Maria. You're on mute, Maria.
So I did my assessment for the Americas, Europe, and Oceania, which was 93 countries. And first, I want to take you over the methodology I developed. So the rapid assessment was based on screening out open source data from non-official government sources. So for example, media, NGO reports were not included in my analysis. The data availability criteria was based on national law enforcement agency and government institutions in charge of CITES compliance. So the data that was reported from these different institutions. So the assessment was done looking at the government websites for each jurisdiction, CITES reports when they were available. And then in the cases where the data wasn't available, I identified focal points for data reporting. So at the next stage, we could contact the focal points to gather more data. Then the main data sources that I identified was EU TWICS, which covers the EU, then CITES annual reports, then World Customs Enforcement Network, national data, and then looked into some Europol and Interpol working groups, which have had specific operations from which data can be sourced. So for example, Cobra 3 and Eagle. So from my results, there was data available from 53 countries, most of them being EU countries, originated from the TWICS database. But the issue with the EU is that there's very little national level data segregation because of the nature of the single market and customs union in the EU. So offenses in the case of wildlife trade would be registered at the seizure port or airport. So for Oceania, we had 3 countries presenting data available. For Europe, 42 countries, for North America, 2, and for the Caribbean, Central and South America, 32 countries. The limitations of data can be explained by countries focusing on crimes of societal interest. So the data that is reported is based on homicide, theft, sexual violence. The robust data sets access was limited to law enforcement agencies, for example, LEMIS from the US and EU TWICS. And then I identified some best practices coming from the US technical cooperation in Central America and the Caribbean. So these best practices were focused on enforcement and interdiction capacities for the illegal wildlife trade. And then they were also providing technical assistance with data reporting, supporting capacity building for reporting and investigations. And in the State Department has a strategy for implementing these types of activities. And then the main sources of information that I found were from regional data collective initiatives. So the Caribbean Wildlife Consortium at the University of the West Indies is a recent initiative which will seek to develop a regional database on wildlife crime for the countries in the Caribbean. Then at the global level, we have LEMIS from the US, which has a 15-year data set going over the importation of wildlife and their derived products. So this is focusing on, once again, wildlife trade and a lot of the seizure data from the source countries coming in. Then in the Balkans, I identified data collection initiatives based on EU-funded projects focusing on the protection of wildlife focused on birds. So here there was data reporting on wildlife poisoning and such. So here there's data availability looking specifically at these wildlife crimes against protected bird species. And then I also identified open source data initiatives, for example, Oxpeckers, who looks into seizures, arrests, court cases, and convictions. So it's a little bit of a more robust data set than, say, NGO reports that are focused on open source data coming from media reports, because there's a bit of disparity when you look at government institutional data compared to databases such as traffic. And the future case studies I identified was the Caribbean Wildlife Initiative. When the results are available or liaising with them, you could get an overall idea of what the state of the art is with wildlife crime in the region. Then for Costa Rica, they have a availability of a database coming from the relevant judicial institutions, which has quantitative and qualitative information that's open source. So you could go and look at that database and start to develop more detailed reports. And then for Ecuador, we have a data set from 2014 to the first quarter of 2022, which lists all the wildlife crime instances that are being processed in the judicial system or have been processed. So you would have information on sentencing, fines, typologies, etc. And then the data analysis limitations that I have identified was, for example, when it comes to CITES regulated trade, there's not disaggregated data between legal and seized animal plants versus illegal non-regulated trade. Most of the data available is focused on destination countries. So for example, the most robust data sets would come from the US, from the EU, and for example, in Australia and Oceania. So we're only capturing international wildlife trade. We're not really developing data sets on domestic wildlife crime, for example, which I know is, from anecdotal evidence, is a big issue, for example, in Brazil and in Mexico and even some countries in Latin America. Most of the data is focused on the wildlife trade and does not usually take into account other types of wildlife crime. And another tendency I found was that IUU fishing tends to be disaggregated from wildlife crime, and this is even reflected in the legislation. For example, in the case of Ecuador, IUU fishing is under a different criminal regime, for example, fisheries laws, and in there we have stipulations for the fines and judicial processing for these types of crimes, whereas more non-maritime wildlife crime and trade is under the criminal code. So we have these differentiated judicial processing regimes, which can have an impact on data reporting. And those were the main results of my assessment. And here are the main future case studies that I identified. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. So I should have said, and Maria's put it perfectly here, is that the sort of the next plan after this project was to answer sort of the next question that always comes up is, okay, we have some idea now of what the state of knowledge is around what the sentencing is or what it looks like globally, but the question obviously then arises, who's using that? Where are they actually using the penalties that they have available to them? So these future case studies is one of the findings we want from this project, is where in the world are there really good data that we could dive in more deeply and actually see if they're following through with their sentencing and their sanctioning and their regimes that they have there. So we'd be more than happy to hear your guys' thoughts on that too, of where you think there's data. And this is a great start, I think, is to sort of the next steps into where we could dive more deeply. So thank you so much, everyone. I'm now going to turn off the recording so that we can take questions or just